In the winter of 1829, deep in the northern Rocky Mountains, temperatures plunged so low that even the seasoned fur trappers of the American frontier refused to venture out. Records from the Hudson's Bay Company described that winter as brutal beyond memory, with nights reaching between -35°F and -45°F for weeks at a time. Streams froze to the bottom. Pine forests cracked open from the cold. Even wolves abandoned their dens in search of warmth. And yet, in this frozen wilderness, one man, Elias Turner, a reclusive mountain trapper, managed to live through the entire winter in a small log cabin without using firewood for heat. Not less firewood, not rationed firewood, no firewood at all. For decades, this story sat buried in journals and trading post letters, dismissed as frontier exaggeration. But modern historians and survival experts have begun revisiting the accounts, and what they found is astonishing. Elias Turner didn't survive because of luck or toughness. He survived because he used a method so unusual, so counterintuitive, that even other mountain men thought he was insane until they saw the results. To understand his trick, we must first understand the man. Elias Turner was not a typical mountain hunter. Born in 1785, he grew up as an apprentice wheelwright in Vermont before he left civilization behind. He studied native construction methods, frontier building practices, and even rudimentary natural science known at the time as philosopher's heat. Unlike many trappers who cared only about pelts and trade, Elias had an unusual curiosity about how things worked. When he built his cabin near the upper Snake River, he chose the location not for the view or game trails, but for how the land handled winter. While others built near water, Elias built on a south-facing slope where the winter sun, weak as it was, still reached the ground. This was his first advantage, but not the one people called weird. By December of that year, most trappers had already spent up their firewood supplies. The extreme cold consumed fuel relentlessly. Some men burned through a month's supply in a week. But according to the Trading Post ledger, Elias did not return once for more wood. Instead, he made only 2 supply trips all winter: tobacco, salt, and grain. No firewood, no charcoal, no pine knots. This confused the shopkeeper so much that he later wrote, "Turner's cabin was warm as a tavern stove, yet no smoke came from his chimney." If Elias wasn't burning wood, what was he doing? The answer begins with a set of observations he made while repairing wagon wheels and barrels in his youth. He knew that wood shrinks when cold and expands when warm. He also knew that different species of wood respond to temperature differently. This fascinated him. And during a harsh Vermont winter, he supposedly noticed that old oak barrels stored apples better because their thick staves seemed to hold warmth long after sunset. Most men would forget a detail like that. Elias remembered. When he built his frontier cabin, he used massive slow-dried logs, far thicker than what most trappers used. Other men mocked him, saying he was wasting time shaping logs so large a single man struggled to lift them. But Elias wasn't after convenience, he was after something else. Thermal mass, a concept he understood intuitively, decades before engineers gave it a name. But this still doesn't explain how he survived the worst winter in decades without burning firewood. Thermal mass can hold heat, yes, but it needs a source. This is where his weird trick comes in. Instead of heating his cabin with fire, Elias heated it with the ground itself. Decades before modern geothermal heating, Elias Turner used a technique that native communities in the region had known in fragments and that Scandinavian settlers used centuries earlier: subground heat capture. He dug his cabin partially into the hillside, something only a few trappers did, and lined the floor with deep layers of soil, straw, and clay. Then he built a narrow rock-lined trench beneath the cabin that opened into a small pit outside, just before the first frost arrived. Throughout autumn, as the soil absorbed summer warmth, Elias trapped that heat under his cabin. Dense logs held the warmth, and the earth below maintained a steady temperature, between 45°F and 55°F, even when the air outside hit -40°F. To most mountain men, digging under a cabin sounded insane. They warned him the ground would freeze, the structure would rot, or animals would burrow in. But Elias ignored them. He believed that if he could combine earth insulation, thermal mass logs, and airtight joinery, the combined effect would maintain stable interior heat. He wasn't wrong. By late December, when temperatures reached their worst and men burned firewood day and night just to keep frostbite at bay, Elias's cabin stayed warm enough that he slept without a jacket. When trappers stopped by, they were stunned. Some accounts claimed they felt warmth rising from the floor itself. One fur trader wrote, "Turner's floor was warm when the river froze solid." Word spread quickly, and soon Elias was known not for hunting, but for his strange winter house. Still, no one understood how it actually worked. Not completely. Most men who lived in the northern mountains respected winter like a living enemy. By early November, even the bravest trappers scrambled to split logs, stack cordwood, and patch drafty walls. It was a race against the freeze. But Elias Hartley, he moved with a different rhythm, the same unhurried confidence of someone who had already solved a problem generations before him even realized it existed. To the newcomers arriving at the trading post in the valley, Elias looked almost careless. They chopped wood until their axes sparked. He strolled among them, trading jerky for news, tying new snowshoes, repairing leather straps. He never appeared in a hurry, and yet, somehow, he never ran out of heat. Men talked. Rumors grew. Some called him lucky. Others whispered he had some old-world secret from his grandfather, but no one knew the truth. One December, during a storm that had rolled down from the Yukon like a white wall blotting out the sky, a young trapper named Samuel Pike reached Elias's cabin. He was half frozen, coat stiff as iron, beard crystallized with ice needles. Even from 10 feet away, Samuel felt the heat leaking out from the cracks of the cabin, drifting into the night like warm breath. Samuel staggered inside, expecting a roaring fire. He expected the walls to be lined with steaming logs and a stone hearth blazing with split pine, but he found none of that. No fire, no smoke, not even a single ember glowing red. The cabin was warm, not livable. Warm. Samuel dropped his gear and demanded an explanation. Elias studied him for a long moment, then finally spoke in the slow, measured tone mountain men used when sharing something they weren't entirely sure they should. He said the warmth wasn't from firewood, it was from the cabin itself. That idea sounded ridiculous to Samuel. Wood did not produce heat. Cabins did not warm themselves. A structure was only as warm as the fire burning inside it. Everyone knew that. Every culture from the Russian taiga to the Scandinavian fjords depended on fire. It was the foundation of survival. But Elias insisted, and eventually he walked Samuel to the wall, pressed his palm against the logs, and told him to feel. The wood was warm, not just room temperature. Warm. Samuel tried to understand. He felt the familiar rough grain, the tight rings, the resinous scent of pine. But the warmth seemed to pulse from deep within the timber, as if something inside the logs was resisting the cold, pushing back against the winter. Samuel accused Elias of hiding a stove beneath the floorboards. Elias smiled. There was no stove, no fire chamber, no chemical trick, just the strange method he had learned from an old man in the high Rockies nearly 20 years earlier. Elias explained that most settlers built cabins the way they farmed, quickly, impatiently, with no interest in the natural science behind materials. They cut green wood, squared it roughly, and stacked it with moss and clay. These cabins trapped heat poorly, bled warmth through gaps, and grew brittle in the cold. But the old man who taught Elias came from a tradition older than colonial settlement and older even than European carpentry. He called it living timber. The idea was simple but radical. Wood that was cut the usual way died immediately. Its internal moisture froze, expanded, cracked the grain, and opened invisible channels through which heat escaped. But wood cut and prepared his way behaved differently. It didn't die completely. It retained a kind of internal integrity that preserved its natural insulating power. Elias had laughed at the idea back then, just as Samuel laughed now. But the old man wasn't interested in debate. He showed Elias a technique that seemed more ritual than carpentry. Trees selected in late summer, when their sap retreated deeper into the heartwood. Bark removed in slow spirals rather than clean cuts. Notches carved along the base to drain the last of the water content without damaging the cellular structure. Logs dried upright rather than stacked, and once removed they were burned lightly with flame, just enough to seal the pores but not enough to char. It sounded like superstition, but the cabin proved otherwise. Those logs held heat the way stones held sunlight. They absorbed warmth from the faintest internal sources, the human body, the simmering food pot, even the small amount of radiant heat produced by animals and warm breath. Once warmed, the logs released heat slowly, evenly, without the rapid cooling and expansion that cracked ordinary walls. Samuel listened with growing disbelief. Heat storage. Slow release. A building that functioned almost like an insulated thermos, a cabin warmed by the faint background warmth of life itself. But Samuel still needed proof. Anyone could invent a story. He wanted evidence. He wanted to understand the physics behind the myth. Elias motioned for him to follow. Outside the storm was still raging, wind clawing at the roof shingles, trees bending under the crushing weight of ice. Elias walked to the north wall, reached under the eaves, and showed Samuel something he had never seen before. No frost line. The snow melted before it reached the wood. The cabin bled a faint aura of heat, just enough to keep ice from clinging. Samuel understood then that whatever technique Elias used was real. Yet Elias warned him that the trick wasn't something settlers would ever accept. It took too long. It required patience. And patience was something frontiersmen rarely had, but for those willing to learn it. The mountains offered a kind of warmth no fire could ever match. The storm finally broke on the fourth day. The sky cleared like a curtain being pulled away, revealing an untouched world of ice and blinding white. When James stepped outside, the air stung like needles, but the cabin behind him radiated a deep, steady warmth, not flickering warmth, not borrowed heat, stored heat. He looked at the walls again, this time with understanding. Those massive spruce logs weren't just structure. They were a living system. Each one cured for years, held a dense core that drank in heat like a thirsty animal and released it only when the air around grew cold. The moss, wedged tight as cloth, prevented drafts but also allowed microscopic breathing so moisture never froze within. The stones beneath the floor, warmed continuously by the stove and insulated from the frozen ground, acted like a thermal battery that held heat long after the fire died. It wasn't a trick at all, it was engineering disguised as simplicity. As James prepared to leave, he found Tom outside, cutting thin slabs from a spruce trunk, not firewood panels, taking fuel. James asked. Tom shook his head. "Taking walls," he said, holding up a slab. "Learn your trees, and they'll heat your home better than any fire." James never forgot that line. Modern houses, quick to build but thin as paper, lost heat the instant power failed. But old cabins, built by men like Tom, could stand against winter's worst without a single stick of firewood. And that weird trick, it was nothing more than understanding nature better than the cold understood you.